Okay, thank you, Stefano, for having me. Thank you to all of you for coming. So I'm Aaron Kozbelt. I'm in the psychology department here. I'm basically a cognitive psychologist. I'm most interested in creativity, especially the creative process. And what I want to talk about today is how some ideas about the creative process are related to and play into human cultural evolution. Now, it's clear that throughout human history, a lot has happened, right? We've gone from Acheulean hand axes to all the nice things that we enjoy today. And at least some of the explanation for that is people like this. So people who are very bright, very creative, come up with new ideas, get them out there, and change the world. And as a psychologist, this is my interest. How can we understand the creative achievements of people like the people you see on the screen? So this is not going to be a completely standard talk. I'm not going to give you, here's the background, here's the question, here are the methods we use, these are the results, here's the what it means. It's a little more free-ranging. It's going to be very interdisciplinary, so there'll be psychology, obviously, but there'll also be a great deal of evolutionary biology, some art history. And so at the outset, I just want to lay out some of the basic themes that I'll be discussing. So as I already mentioned, a key issue is the individual's role in cultural evolution. What can we say about that? I would make the argument that understanding that has a lot to do with how one conceptualizes the creative process, especially the structure of the creative process, something I'm very, very interested in. And then there's the question you could ask: does the creative process itself evolve in some meaningful way? And to get at this issue, I want to bring in two ideas from evolutionary and developmental biology. One is called the evolution of evolvability, and that's the idea that evolution itself evolves in some way to get better at doing what evolution does. I'll have more to say about that shortly. And the second idea is something called ontogenetic heterochrony. And this is the idea that as an organism develops, there are all kinds of events that happen in the course of its development. And if you make small changes in the timing of the events, not even the events themselves, but the timing of the events, that plays a big role in what the organism actually ends up looking like and being like. Okay? And I think both of these ideas actually tell us a lot about the nature of the creative process. But it paints a very different picture of the creative process than what most psychologists researching this issue would say. And so if we take advantage of these concepts and use them to rethink the nature of creativity, it turns out that this is a way of understanding creativity in a much richer and more unified way. So you can take these ideas and develop them, and it turns out this allows you to link up all kinds of different levels of analysis in the study of creativity. And at the end, I want to get to, well, what are some of the implications for cultural evolution? Implications that are different when you emphasize these kinds of factors compared to when you don't. Okay? So that's roughly the structure. That's basically the set of themes I'm going to be working with. Now, so we're all on the same page. Let me give you the blitz version of what creativity is all about. There are lots of different definitions of creativity, but they basically boil down to two main criteria: novelty and value. So when we call something creative, what do we mean? Well, we usually mean that this is something new, something we haven't seen before, and also that it's valuable, it's useful, it solves some kind of problem. It's just not new for its own sake, but we can actually work with it in some meaningful way. Okay? These criteria, like I said, are pretty standard, and they're going to become more important as the talk goes along, so I ask you not to forget them. Okay? Psychologists also make a distinction between different levels of creativity. So you can talk about big C creativity, the kind of creativity that is sort of world-changing, the kind that the people a few slides back, that's their kind of creativity. There's also little c creativity. If you have a friend who's really great at coming up with ideas for a new Halloween costume every year, okay, that's probably a good example of little c creativity. Doesn't change the world, but it's interesting that this person can come up with this novel idea that everybody likes. Okay? Now, I'm going to focus more on the big C aspects of creativity throughout the talk. Little c aspects are interesting too, right? How does anyone come up with something new? But my focus will be big C. The creative process, which is the star of the show here, there are lots of different ways of understanding it. There are models going back to the 1920s that said, look, when you talk about creativity and creative insights, there's basically a set sequence of stages that happens. So there's a period where a person works on a problem and doesn't really make a lot of progress. We call that preparation. They then take a break. Later on, when they're not thinking of anything particular, the answer suddenly hits them. This is the sort of insight or illumination phase. And after that moment of insight, then they can go and work out the details and package it in a form that is acceptable to everybody else. Okay? Now, the linearity of this conception of creativity, of one stage followed by another stage, that linearity has been largely discredited. People agree now that, yeah, there's all kind of goings back and forth between these different stages. But the idea itself is important, that you have this moment of realization and that key idea that is the essence of creativity, that's still something that's very much with us, which I want to dispute a little bit and we'll continue to talk about. Other than these stage models, where you have one thing, then another thing, then another thing in the course of a creative event, the other side of the pendulum is what are called componential models. So people have swung to the other extreme and said, look, the whole idea of stages is ridiculous. And if you're going to be able to interconnect and pull things around all over the place, why not just lay out the basic processes or characteristics that are essential for creativity, assume that they all kind of interact together more or less continuously, and leave it at that. And so, in this view, the goal of understanding the creative process is identifying the nature of these components. Now, these can be cognitive components, these can be basic mental processes like combining ideas or making analogies. They can also be more dispositional factors, like a willingness to take risks. Or factors like, hey, this person has a really unusual background, and so they have lots of unusual associations between one idea and another idea. Now, both of these kinds of models, stage models and componential models, deprive the creative process of any real systematic structure. On the one hand, you have this sort of very oversimplified sequence of stages that isn't particularly true or interesting. On the other hand, you have all these different things interacting, and if everything's connected to everything else, then there's no structure. Okay? I want to try to figure out a way to achieve a structured understanding of the creative process. And when I bring in these ideas from evolutionary biology, those are going to be ways of doing so, hopefully. Now, built into a lot of the work people have done on the nature of creativity are a few implicit assumptions. And these are really important because depending on how you view the creative process, you're going to have very different implications for all kind of practical, theoretical, larger scale questions than you would otherwise have. So one I've already alluded to, and this is a bias towards thinking that generating an idea is really the central thing about creativity. You want to be creative, what do you need? Well, you got to have a great idea, and that has gone almost unquestioned. Okay? Whereas the process of taking that idea or some vague sense that maybe there's an idea there and elaborating it, developing it into some finished product, that usually gets downplayed quite a bit, and I think that's a mistake. Okay? So, one assumption, this ideation bias. Second assumption is what I'll call domain generality. Most of the theories of the creative process that are out there are very all-purpose. They apply just as well in principle to physics as to composing music, even though the activity of the creator is grounded in a particular domain, right? What a musician is thinking about when he or she is composing is very different from what a physicist is thinking about. Okay? So maybe we need to scrap this idea of domain generality. So even though we won't have this super sexy, parsimonious theory that explains everything, we'll at least be able to say something substantive about particular interesting areas. Okay, so this is another direction I'm going to go when I talk about some art historical issues later. Most relevant to the theme of the seminar is the idea that the creative process has been historically invariant, that it really hasn't fundamentally changed in the course of human history, and partly I think that's because the models that exist are so abstract that you don't really know how they should change in order to be able to detect any change in the creative process over time. Okay? So if you start to question some of these assumptions, then this opens up and develop hopefully better models of the creative process. Then this may open up the question of, does the creative process evolve over time? Now, I'll give you my answer. Has the creative process evolved? Yeah, I think it's evolved. I think it's evolved in some interesting ways. You can approach this from a couple different perspectives. So obviously, phylogenetically, the creative process has evolved. Okay? If you compare modern humans to our ancestors going back several 100,000, million or 2 years, clearly things are very different. And I think a lot of this has to do with the development of the brain, particularly the development of executive function and working memory. It's just hard to create something interesting if you can only keep one or two things in mind at a time. Modern humans can certainly keep a lot more in mind at a time, and so this is certainly a factor that has enabled increases in creativity over the long haul. There are also socio-cultural factors. These go back into prehistory as well. So man and woman, people being a social animal, we work in groups, we sometimes work very well in groups, and that kind of social facilitation, I think also has a role in how the creative process evolves. If you can start to rely on other people to know things or to be good at certain things or to do this particular job, then that's going to change how you approach solving certain kinds of problems. Even in the modern age, with the advent of the internet and the possibility of collaborations with people you've never physically met, one could argue that socio-cultural factors evolving the creative process are alive and well. What I'm interested in is more at the individual level. Okay? So if you look at individual creators throughout history, in what way has the creative process evolved for them? And this is where we come into our first concept from biology, the evolution of evolvability. This is the idea. Organisms improve their own capacity to survive and reproduce, right? That's basic natural selection, but also the lineage's capacity to evolve. Okay? And here's a great quote by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Ancestor's Tale. This is one of the very closing pages. There could be, and I believe are, major events in evolutionary history after which the very nature of evolution itself changes. Evolution itself might be said to evolve. Might evolution itself become better at doing something? What evolution does as history goes by? Is late evolution some kind of improvement on early evolution? Okay. These are very provocative questions anyway, but especially coming from someone like Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous biologist in the world, and has said explicitly that if you encounter life anywhere in the universe, it will be the result of natural selection, which Charles Darwin discovered and published about in 1859. That's essentially the story. So the possibility that such a hardliner as Dawkins is willing to entertain the idea that, well, maybe there's something interesting going on in this process. The process of evolution is so creative that it changes itself over time, is especially provocative. Now, these major events that Dawkins talks about, he cites a few very explicitly. So the development of eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei, multicellularity, sexual reproduction, and he especially focuses on bodily segmentation. So if you look at lots of different organisms, arthropods, annelids, vertebrates, you see what the body plan is like. There's this sort of set of segments, each of which is developed in its own way, and you get this great variety of different body types. Okay? Now, this is interesting for Dawkins, and it points to a key feature of the evolution of evolvability, which is how these things get the way they are in the first place as the organism itself develops. Okay? So he will say something like, it's pretty hard to believe that there was a generation of organisms that had no segments, and then there was this mutation, and then the very next generation you have this segmented organism. So a child that looks very different from the parents. But if you're going to start simple and end up with this sort of thing, then that has to have happened at some point. And once that happens, once bodily segmentation is invented, if you can build two segments, you can build as many segments as you want. Once you separate these segments out into different physical entities, then you can grow these segments in very different ways. And so there's this modularity, this breaking up, this division of labor among these different body parts, so that what happens in the front of an organism can do one thing, and that development doesn't really have to impact what's happening in the rest of the organism. So segmenting out an organism in this way really opens up lots of possibilities for fairly rapid morphological change. And that's what he means by the evolution of evolvability. Once this innovation happens, there's just all kind of potential that just was not there before. A couple other things about the evolution of evolvability. One way to think about what this means is in terms of speciation, the development of new species. Sometimes speciation is due to physical or geographic factors. So if you imagine an archipelago of islands, some archipelagos will have the islands so far apart that the animals on one island can't ever get to the other island. And there's not a lot of opportunities for interesting things to happen in that case. Similarly, if all the islands are really close together, then basically anybody can get from any island to any other island. And again, you don't have this sort of pockets of isolation that are really good for creating diversity. If, however, the islands are kind of a medium distance apart, define that however you want, then the individual populations will be isolated enough, they can sort of evolve a little bit on their own, adapting to local conditions, and there'll be the occasional traveler from one island to the other island to really shake things up in terms of the genetics. Okay? So often physical factors play a key role in speciation and the evolution of evolvability. But another factor, which Dawkins emphasizes even more, is the idea of embryological development, that the individual organism's growth pattern is what really lends itself to this kind of flexibility. So the morphological flexibility that we see in segmented animals comes directly out of the embryological processes that give rise to those animals, specifically breaking the process up into all these different segments, each of which can go its own direction. Okay? This embryological aspect is something that's very important. We'll come back to with the second idea. But first, a couple of other points. When you talk about one of these innovations happening, there's a strong element of irreversibility. Okay, so most micro-mutations in an organism, they happen. If conditions change a little bit, it might sort of flip back on itself. And the idea of the evolution of evolvability is that these kinds of changes, these big changes, are not like that. That even if segmentation is not immediately relevant to the survival of an organism, right, as long as it's not harmful, it will be there ready to break open whenever the conditions are right. So if conditions change, or there's a new ecosystem that opens up, or new niches that open up, the organisms that are best able to take advantage of that will be the ones that have gone through these watersheds, like segmentation. Okay? And so this idea of niche filling, the ability of these organisms rapidly to change over some number of generations and take over new parts of their environment that weren't taken over before, is also key. And the upshot is, if you have a system, an evolving system, that becomes really good at evolving, that you end up with these wonderfully rich, biodiverse, interconnected ecosystems, the kind of you picture, well, what's the lushest place on Earth? You get images like this. This is what the evolution of evolvability leads to. If you have systems where that's not the case, or there hasn't been time for these innovations to accrue, I mean, this is what you get, this kind of barren landscape. This could be Mars if you dye the sky pink. Okay? So there's a lot of variety in different places, and the evolution of evolvability probably has something to do with that. Now, what does this have to do with human creativity? Well, there are a couple of different ways to try to make this connection. So one way is to think in terms of these basic mental processes that undergird human creativity. Things like I said before, combining different concepts into some new concept, making analogies, expanding a concept, heuristic search through problem spaces, the emotional response a person has to a particular artifact. All of these basic processes that would play some role in human creativity. Now, if we think in terms of, well, would these really represent a watershed? My answer is probably yes, but only probably in prehistoric terms. So only when it became possible for the human mind to really combine concepts readily did that change the game. Nowadays, these basic processes are more or less universal. And so since we can't trace them back to their point of origin, they don't really qualify for as a watershed. A better candidate is the idea of paradigm shifts. This was an idea popularized by Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he looked at domains like physics and said, look, there are certain periods in physics or other hard sciences where everything changes. You're working within a certain set of assumptions and rules and procedures, and things begin not to work as well as they used to. More discoveries pile up that can't be explained, and the way out of that is essentially to completely get rid of this old way of doing things, this old paradigm, and to invent a new paradigm. So when Ptolemaic astronomy could no longer explain the positions of the planets, or could only do so by bending backwards several times, Copernicus comes along and says, wait, we can solve a lot of these problems, at least in principle, if we put the sun rather than the Earth at the center of the solar system. And it works, and it's an improvement, and that's the way our part of the universe operates. Okay? Similarly with Newtonian mechanics or Einstein's relativity or quantum mechanics, anything like that. Now, paradigm shifts have this irreversible quality and this sort of fruitfulness that once you change the rules, well, all these things that weren't questions before, weren't legitimate questions before, become legitimate questions now. The limitation of paradigm shifts as related to evolution of evolvability watersheds is that they're really based on the final products, right? There's no sense of what the psychological processes that contribute to a paradigm shift or the reception of a paradigm shift might be. And so, personally as a psych person, that's dissatisfying. Okay? A similar claim can be made about something called meta-inventions. These are described by Charles Murray in his book, Human Accomplishment. And he talks about certain inventions that human beings have come up with that are not physical inventions. Right? This is the printing press. But they're cognitive tools, like Arabic numerals, linear perspective, meditation, ethics, written language. These kind of things that did not exist at some point in the past, people figure out, hey, we can actually work much better if we do this particular way, and then this changes everything.
Yeah, question, where would critical thinking fall in those three?
Where would critical thinking fall? Yeah. As a possible watershed, or just in general? I think it contributes to all of them. So certainly the ability to get the wheat from the chaff as a basic aspect of creative thinking, creative critical thinking, is there. Certainly the dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs that leads to leads to a meta-invention or a paradigm shift would be there. I think it's probably even more salient when we get to the next one, schemas, which I'm going to prioritize. But certainly, I think critical processes are an important aspect of any kind of human creativity. So I don't know if I evaded it by saying we're all right, but that's my take. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? If you have questions of clarification, please jump in. I'm happy to answer them. Okay. Like paradigm shifts, the idea of meta-inventions is kind of cool. It does seem to correspond to a lot about evolution of evolvability watersheds. But again, there's not really a strong sense of the processes. Now, there's another concept that is more psychologically grounded called schemas, which I think are a better route to unpacking this set of issues. Schemas differ from paradigm shifts and meta-inventions in that they do have a greater process orientation. They try to unpack the nature of the experience as a psychological event, much more so than these other guys. In that sense, schemas applied to this problem are, I think, much more informative both to researchers like me who care about understanding what's actually going on, but they're also amenable to use by the creators themselves. So because, as I'll tell you, schemas are grounded in particular kinds of problems, creators themselves who are immersed in those problems can understand the nature of what they're doing and can then decide to change it. Okay? Now, what are schemas? Schemas are mental structures. They allow one to perceive or act effectively by anticipating the organization of what one apprehends or does. So basically, you don't have to function from scratch. We use schemas all the time. They've sometimes been called the building blocks of cognition, and they're very domain-specific or situation-specific. So this is the third talk in this series. Those of you who've been to the other talks have a schema for what these talks are like. If you've gone to McDonald's at some point in your life, You have a schema for what to do at McDonald's, right? You don't wait to be seated. You don't expect to pay the bill after you've gotten your food, right? In contrast to a restaurant that's a little nicer than McDonald's, where you do expect to be seated, you expect to, be physically handed a menu, you expect to pay at the end. You might have to leave a tip, that's the downside, but so it goes. And so for lots of everyday situations, we have these kinds of schemas. Now, people who are immersed in the creative activity of a domain also have schemas for what they do. As a psychological researcher, I have lots of schemas, I hope, for addressing different kinds of research questions. And as I sort of try to be a little metacognitive, try to reflect on what it is I'm doing, I can unpack the various aspects of my schema. And this is the key point that will link schemas with these earlier questions. The process modularity of schemas, the ability to take them and break them into these parts, links embryological development with the creative process. Because in embryological development, pretty much exactly the same thing is happening. You have these stages of development that will change, and if you modify things having to do, say, with the timing of those stages, you're going to get changes on the back end. I saw some questions. Yeah?
Now, are these synonymous with frames?
They have a lot in common with frames or scripts. Scripts are usually, and frames are more structured, more tightly structured. So, when you go to McDonald's, usually it's the same damn thing that happens every time. Whereas if you are in a much more complex domain, there's a lot more flexibility in what happens. The more interesting the problem, the richer the schema, the greater the scope for varying that schema. Okay? Now I'm interested in schemas in visual art. This is a cartoon from the beginning of one of my favorite books, a book called Art and Illusion by the great art historian E.H. Gombrich. Gombrich, in writing this book, asked himself a few questions. He wanted to know what happens when a person sits down and tries to draw what's in front of them. Okay? And a related question is, why does realistic art have a history? Because if you can just sit down and in principle copy everything you see perfectly, then why should that ever change? That's a very satisfying mode of production, and you shouldn't expect to see any evolution. And his answer was, well, of course it's not that simple. When you look at the world, you don't just get this bottom-up information and are able to make sense of it perfectly. What you know, what you expect, the schemas that you bring to the situation greatly impact your perception. And so the idea with this cartoon is, here we are obviously at an art school in ancient Egypt, and you see the artists very carefully measuring with their pencils to get the proportions just right. And what are they doing? Of course they're drawing pictures that look exactly like the style that they've been trained in, and indeed, when they look at the model, they see the model through the lens of that style. Okay, so this, Gombrich himself said this summarizes my book better than the rest of the book, basically. It's still a great book. And so this is the idea, that schemas have this pervasive effect on perception and on action, and they've been reasonably well unpacked in visual art. Okay? So now I'm going to sort of mostly stay in the realm of visual art and bring in the second biological idea, which is this embryological analogy. So I think there's an analogy to be made between human creativity and the development of individual organisms. On the one hand, you have a genetic code, which sort of gives you the plan for creating this organism. On the creativity side, you have this notion that generating ideas is really the engine of creativity. You can't do anything without generating new ideas. Okay? Once you have the genetic code, or once you have your rough ideas, then there's this process in biology of ontogenetic development, where you take the genetic code and let it do what it does to grow the organism, or you have your ideas and then you elaborate them into some finished form. Scientific paper, a poem, painting, whatever. Okay? Now, as I pointed out before, this idea of an ideation bias, most creativity theories privilege the first thing, generating ideas. So how do people create novelty? Well, they create it by new ideas or new conceptual combinations. Okay? And there's embarrassingly little attention paid to the second step here. Okay? But the alternative that I want to push is that you can also create novelty by altering the process of creation itself, okay, in terms of how the ideas are elaborated. So it's not so much what the ideas are, but how you play with those ideas and develop them into some kind of finished creative product. And this is where the notion of ontogenetic heterocracy comes in. Ontogenetic just means the development of one particular organism, like you or me or your cat or pigeon outside, whoever. Heterocracy just refers to changes in timing. Okay? So large differences in organisms' morphology can arise from small changes in the timing of developmental events. This idea is probably best laid out in Stephen Jay Gould's book, Ontogeny and Phylogeny. Ontogeny, as I said, is the development of a particular organism. Phylogeny is the development of species over time. And there's this old saying, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, that in the development of an individual organism, it kind of goes through all the ancestral stages of its distant ancestors. So, human embryos have gills, that sort of thing. And that's not strictly true, but if these ideas are unpacked, we can get quite a bit of conceptual mileage out of them. Whoops. Okay, so to illustrate this idea, humans and chimpanzees share about 99% of our DNA, but we are very different, right? You are not a chimp, I'm not a chimp, chimp is not us. We differ profoundly in our cognition, in our morphology, the way our bodies are put together. And so here's a question: how do you want to explain these huge differences? Is it just due to this 1% difference in the DNA, or would we rather talk about the sort of ontogenetic developmental processes, the way these programs play out? It turns out that juvenile chimps look more human than adult chimps do. And so, did I hear an awe? Wait till the next slide. Many aspects of human development are actually retarded compared to chimpanzees. So when a human baby is born, they're sort of younger in some basic sense than a newborn chimpanzee. Now, what happens if you slow down these early stages? You enable a prolonged childhood where you can learn lots and lots of information about your environment. And for creatures like us, that turns out to be very adaptive. So these are my two kids, that's why I said wait till the next slide. So one before, one after. So even in the time from a couple months in the womb till a newborn, lots of things happen. But the point is there's lots of things still to happen in the future. And if you slow down or you otherwise play with the timing of these events, you can achieve quite a lot. Another quick example, variation in Galapagos finches. So these are the birds that Darwin studied that really nailed a lot of his ideas about natural selection down. One distinguishing feature of a lot of these different species are their beaks. So some of these have very short beaks, other ones have much longer beaks. And if you look genetically at what's going on, this variation emerges through brief differences in when one particular gene is on. So the birds with the short, fat beaks, this gene turns on day 5 of embryological development. With the long, skinny beaks, it turns on day 6. That's it. No difference in the genes, it's just a question of when you turn this thing on. And you get enough variation in the morphology to allow Darwin to come up with natural selection. Okay. I want to apply these ideas to visual art, partly because I know a lot about visual art, I've studied visual art, and there are certain other advantages for understanding how these ideas play out in artistic creativity. So first of all, painting, drawing, sculpture, these are structured by the manipulation of material properties, right? If someone's drawing or painting, you can watch them at work, you can see exactly what's happening on the page, you can videotape it, okay? So there's a really nice paper trail if you want to get at the processes. Also, the activity of artists is very constrained by the media. If you've worked with artistic media, you'll know what I mean. If you paint with oils, there's a very particular sequence you have to do so the painting will completely destroy itself by cracking when it dries. If you think about fresco painting on a wall, the sort of thing that Michelangelo would do, you are basically putting dry pigment onto wet plaster. So you have to put down only as much plaster as you can know you'll paint in a day. You have to keep sprinkling water on it. You have to work it just the right way. You have to plan the whole thing out in advance, otherwise you'll make a mess. And you have to work from the top to the bottom so you don't splash the work down here that you've already finished based on what you're doing up there. Okay? Lots of constraints there on the activity. It's not just run in and do whatever you want. There are also what I'll call non-accidental aspects of depiction. And I use the word non-accidental advisedly. Perceptual psychologists talk about non-accidental properties of images. So if you want to understand how it is that the human visual system is so good at recognizing objects, well, it turns out that there are some key pieces of information that the visual system will latch onto. Okay, so it turns out if you look at line drawings of objects, places where there are vertices, corners, where the lines come together, that gives you much more information about the three-dimensional structure of the objects than just about anything else. So you can take a line drawing and wipe out everything except the vertices, maybe a little symmetry, and you'll be able very readily to understand what is being shown. Now, what artists do is essentially what the visual system does. They have to create a representation of what a perceptual experience is like, and they have to do it using relatively limited means. And so artists, it turns out, are very good at picking up on these non-accidental aspects of depiction. So that's another way in which there's an intrinsic structure to the process of making at least realistic art, right? If you don't pay attention to these non-accidental aspects, it's going to look terrible. You're not going to be able to tell what it is. Okay? Finally, as an artist works, the process traces what they've been doing, the revisions they've made, are often evident in the products. Now, probably the best place to begin to apply this framework is in the history of realism in Western art, from roughly 1300 to 1900. So, this is an example of cultural evolution, right? In 1300, the painting on the left, you have this work by Giotto, who's essentially the founder of Western realistic painting. His work is already a large advance over the sort of flat Byzantine painting of the medieval times. And over the next few centuries, artists worked very hard to develop their schemas, right? The history of art is essentially the history of artists' schemas. And so they learn all these tricks about the nature of the visible world, about how to represent those in a depiction, until by the late 19th century you have artists able to do this. This is a painting by Bouguereau, who has really gotten the shaft, though in fairness not as much as this guy, but he's not the most respected artist. Giotto is seen as one of the greatest painters of all time, and you see this interesting tension. Once everybody learns the tricks, well then, it's kind of passe. So something is happening in the evolution of artistic techniques in this time that makes paintings essentially look more and more real, however you want to define that. Okay, now, what are artist schemas like? Well, they're using schemas in a dynamic way, in a way that accounts not just for what the final product should look like, but what it should look like up to all different points in time till it's finished. A lot of times there are hypotheses that get tested, like I can't really tell if I'm supposed to draw this line here or here, what will look better, so let me just try it. I'm going to try it, I'm going to evaluate it, and then I'm going to take it from there and revise it if I have to. Okay? Now, much as we like to romanticize art, for the vast majority of this time period, artists were professionals. You'd get commissions, you had to be able to produce. So a lot of the schemas are built around very efficient production. Okay, so the heuristics that go into and comprise schemas are there so that artists can do what they need to do well and quickly. Okay? And if you can unpack this, I'll say right up front, nobody's done this unpacking in a serious way. A few years from now, I hope people will say, oh yeah, I did that. Okay, but at this point in time, no one has really unpacked it. But I think it can be done. If you can do this with the constraints outlined before, this gives you a kind of necessary default baseline for identifying changes of timing relative to that standard. What are some of the heuristics for efficient rendering? What might they be? Well, first of all, plan the work in advance. Don't work this big if you can work this big and get it figured out. Okay? The more revision you have to do, it's a waste of time. Don't worry about it. First, outline the important information using linear denotation, and then later fill it in. This is kind of like a coloring book principle. It's much easier to just draw the outline and then fill it in later than to try to build the whole thing up from scratch. Get the basic proportions right before adding details. Add the most detail to the most important objects. Those are where viewers' attentions get allocated. Make the most important objects the most salient and distinct from the background, right? If it's minor stuff, you don't have to worry about it, but you really want to call attention to what's most important. And minimize process traces. Okay? For most of art history, patrons didn't like that. They wanted a nice, finished, pretty picture. And that was that. Okay, now, where do these heuristics come from? Well, here and there are training manuals that were left by artists that Gombrich discussed a great deal. If you go into a good bookstore, there are tons of books on how to draw that list a lot of these heuristics very explicitly. So it's possible to combine a lot of these. Also, just watch artists at work. These are some still frames from video of artists just drawing objects in front of her. You can detect a lot of these heuristics at work very readily, even among artists working today. Okay? Now, once you have the set way of doing things, now you can make the process really interesting by introducing these changes of timing. So imagine it's a few years from now and I've solved this problem, there's no wood, there we go, and I've given you a flow chart of this is how artists work to create a realistic image. Once you have that basic set of boxes, at any point you can begin to take these stages, condense them, expand them, truncate them, reorder them, eliminate some of them, add some of them. Any of these can generate novelty in the final products without requiring novel initial ideas. So it's not what an artist decides to paint, it's how they decide to go about painting it and how they decide to develop those ideas. I should also point out, in line with the Giotto-Bouguereau example, that over time, good heterocrities, ones that are seen as valuable, can get absorbed into the standard working methods. So I don't mean to say that one, flow chart that would suffice for the entire history of realistic painting. There's certainly going to be evolution there, and incidentally, this is the main advantage from a researcher's perspective of trying to understand the process in this way. Okay? If you can identify these very specific aspects of the process of creation, then it becomes much easier to identify when the changes happen and to think about how this whole process of cultural evolution has gone along. Okay? Now, if you look at the history of art, not all artists play by the rules, okay, obviously. There are some artists that I will call heterochronous artists. Okay? These are artists who work pretty inefficiently. They violate the standard heuristics for depiction for whatever reason. They get attention by producing novelty due to how they execute a work rather than the basic ideas that go into the work. Often they will build on tradition they're not interested in, rejecting tradition. They want to take the best of the earlier tradition and build on it. And what's especially interesting to me is that if you look at the careers of these individuals and when they produce their best work, the artists who appear to introduce heterocracies in their process seem to show unusually late career peaks. Okay, most, in the visual arts, artists will often, on average, peak sometime in their 30s. Many of these artists are doing well into their 60s and even beyond. Okay? I pay a lot of attention to the idea of career peaks because it speaks to a couple themes that I think are really important that come at the very end of the talk, which are, to what extent can the creative process be controlled, right? To what extent is there sort of sustainable development of creativity, rather than just doing something awesome and then burning out and not doing anything that anybody cares about? Again, the ability of some artists to ride that wave for an extremely long time and to have this thing in common, this ability to use heterocracies, is, I think, a really telling point. There's an economist, David Galenson, who sort of categorized artists in terms of their working methods. And one group he calls seekers, these late peaking, build on tradition kind of guys here. Now, who are these guys? Well, a good example is Leonardo. Leonardo essentially invented a completely new way of doing drawings. Rather than doing these nice, crisp outlines that were basically very neat and orderly, he would just make a bunch of marks and sort of grow a form, evolve a form as he worked. So you have, some of these drawings are very, very sort of hard to understand, but allowed him to explore his ideas in a way that the traditional methods of doing drawings just did not allow. Now, this had its downside. When he painted The Last Supper, he didn't want to paint just a straight fresco where you had to plan it all out in advance. He wanted to be able to make changes throughout the entire process. And of course, what happened, he had to invent his own method of painting, and it just chemically didn't work, and the painting was deteriorating even within Leonardo's own lifetime. So there is a downside, but it's very characteristic of his working methods. Michelangelo is another very good example of this. Michelangelo's range of heterochronies is very wide, from his early Roman Pietà and the David, the works he did in his 20s, which have just an unprecedented level of uniform finish over the statues. After he finished the David, he started moving much more in the realm of unfinished looking works, and in some cases would even sort of reverse the usual degree of finish. So in a statue, normally you expect the face to be the focus of attention, the key part. This is the most underdeveloped section of all. Meanwhile, the musculature and the rest of the body is very, very thoroughly worked out and polished. Michelangelo would also sometimes make very radical 11th hour changes. This is the very last statue he ever worked on, within a week or so of his death. And at one time it was almost finished, and then it's Mary holding the dead body of Christ. At one point he just hacked the entire head and torso of Christ out, redid it so that the head of Christ is physically inside the space of Mary's shoulder. This is nuts. This is not the kind of way to make a statue. But this is what he did, and you get this overwhelmingly expressive result. Okay? Other guys in painting, Titian, another contemporary of Michelangelo, basically worked with very, very loose brushwork, invented a way of painting that was on the verge of Impressionism in the mid-1500s. He would also, apply the paint with his fingers, do all kinds of crazy stuff that no painter had ever done before. And again, you get this very rich, expressive quality. Similarly with Velázquez, who's probably, in my book, the greatest painter of all time. He's doing things with unfinished passages here that were absolutely unprecedented. This portrait of Pope Innocent II, if you look closely, these black brush marks, which don't stand out really, but were among the last strokes painted. That's the kind of mark you make when you're just laying out and blocking out where the lights and darks should be. That's not the last stroke you do in a painting. So again, that kind of reordering of stages is telling. Briefly, the Impressionists pushed a lot of these trends of looseness even further, and many of them had quite a bit of staying power throughout their careers. Cézanne is another great example, again, often leaving sections very unfinished, and in this Vega, this one's at MoMA, if you go and look at this, you'll see this really interesting line that's scraped right around the chin of the figure. As with the Velázquez, that's one of the very last lines that he would have put down on that section of the painting. That should have been the first one, right? Let's get the basic oval of the face. My favorite example, and probably the artist who shows the most heterochronies, is Matisse, who I won't go into because it would take the rest of the afternoon, but viewed through this lens, he makes just about everybody else look terrible, but has this phenomenal range of handling of paint and changes in the process. Now, the story would not be super interesting if all great artists were the ones who violated the standards of ways of doing things. And so it turns out that there are also some noteworthy non-heterochronies artists. These are artists who basically stick to the rules. They work very efficiently. They get attention not by their execution, but rather by their ideas. So they have some neat idea, they put it into the standard way of doing things, they crank it out, and they're basically done. A lot of times these guys will rebel against tradition, and unlike the earlier group, many of these artists show a very early career peak. 20s, early 30s, and they might live for 50 years thereafter, but never quite recoup that level. In Galen's terminology, these are finders, which is a nice term. And here are just a few examples. Another Renaissance artist, Raphael, who mastered every style of his time and worked beautifully in it, and no fuss there. Raphael was able to delegate a lot of his later work to assistants because they had been trained in his workshop and knew, oh, this is the schema for making a Raphael. Great, let's do it. Okay. The Surrealists, perfect example of artists who get their renown by what they paint rather than how they paint. So artists like Magritte, Dali paint these really unusual combinations of objects, but the paintings themselves are often fairly tame in terms of the execution. And again, these guys are doing their best work in their early 30s. Picasso is another very good example. Here's a real rebel in many ways. His methods of putting the pictures together, very, very straightforward. Despite his great range of styles, he's sort of the ultimate coloring book artist. He lays down the line, he fills it in, and he's all set. And even when he doesn't appear to be doing that, like in this Harlequin at MoMA, you might think, well, wait, what's all this going on here? If you do a figure ground reversal so that the white part is the background, it turns out that he's just painted around his own profile. Okay, so even there, what seems to be the exception is consistent with his way of working. Okay. If this framework is useful, why is it useful? What are some potential advantages? First of all, I think that it has great potential to add structure to the creative process, and just understanding what the heck is going on when a person sits down and tries to do something. Partly this is because it's very domain specific. It takes into account the particulars of the media in which people work, the kinds of problems they face, and it puts the process on their terms, the creator's terms, rather than trying to impose this all-purpose model. Also, there seems to be at least hints of some pretty good predictive validity. So if you look at the career trajectories of these two sets of artists, they're very, very different. And this suggests that introducing changes of timing into the process create opportunities for learning that enable these late-peaking artists to sort of keep working. And there's an application to other domains. So Galenson, this finder-seeker typology, has applied this idea to a bunch of other domains. I've done work applying it to classical music. And so it seems to be fairly robust. So what's the upshot here? So basically, if you take this view of looking at the creative process in this schema-driven way, unpacking schemas into constituent elements which can be rearranged in timing-dependent, highly generative ways, can yield an understanding of how the creative process may evolve over time. You get a nice, rich, detailed, descriptive model that gives you a basis for seeing how that changes. And not only does it have implications for the individual creators and things like their career trajectories, but some implications for cultural evolution as well. So let me just mention one more bit. My favorite book on creativity is this work by Colin Martindale called The Clockwork Muse. The subtitle is The Predictability of Artistic Change. And he looks very carefully at the dynamic of creators in any artistic domain and how they work over centuries within a tradition and how artistic styles change. And he's basically argued that this dynamic leads to the death of art. Okay? So in his view, what are artists trying to do? Well, they're trying to get critical attention. They want people to recognize their work. And so what they have to do is to get that attention. Now, Martindale has this so-called Darwinian model of creativity, where you have sort of blind combinations, variations of ideas, and then you select some of them and work to develop them. It's a very, very probability and chance-intensive model of the creative process. There's not a whole lot of room for control of the process here. And so artists are pretty much doing whatever they can to get the attention. Now, artists can get attention in a bunch of different ways. You can make something bigger, brighter, louder. That'll get attention. You can try to make something more meaningful. That's kind of subjective, though. The easiest way is just to, or the richest way, I should say, is just to be different. Okay? Make something novel. Make these crazy combinations of ideas in the context of people looking at 100 paintings in a gallery. The crazy ones will be the ones that stand out. And those sort of continually raise the bar over time. Now, as the generations go by, artists continue to try to outdo each other, and eventually you get to the point where there's so much novelty that it ceases to communicate. If you've been to modern galleries, listen to modern classical music, you might read modern poetry, you might know what I mean. It's just hard to know what any of the stuff is supposed to be. And so there's this evolutionary trap set by defining art in this way. Martin has a great sentence somewhere. The high arts were defined in such a way that guaranteed that they would evolve a certain way and die a certain way. And that's essentially what he's talking about. So at that point, the art form becomes extinct, and you got to find something else to do. Now, this is obviously a bummer, and we'd like to be able to find some way out of this, and I think there is. As I said, Martindale's view of creativity is one of these very ideation-intensive views. It emphasizes novelty, and it's almost like there's rampant originality in the arts just for its own sake. Okay? But if you take that other criterion of creativity, value, and think that, well, elaboration of ideas is at least as important as the basic ideas themselves, then you can rethink the job of artistic creativity, not just as let's be original to get attention, but let's try to find adaptive solutions to problems by developing really rich symbol systems and artistic traditions. And when you take these ideas, you focus on value rather than just the raw originality. You focus on using the best things in previous traditions rather than trying to just rebel against them. You work in complex genres, complex problems. You have control over the creative process, which the Darwinian view does not. And maybe most importantly, you have a way of modifying and evolving the creative process itself. All the things that I've talked about today, such that it's not just the ideas you put in that make a difference, but there's this enormous flexibility for changing the creative process itself and branching out into new directions. This, I think, gives you a view of cultural evolution that's very different from this death of art view of Martindale, where you can have great sustainability over time. And when you look at what evolution can achieve, including evolving its own process of evolution, this is a much more optimistic view. And so taking this perspective that what matters is really adaptive solutions to problems, conceptualizing biological evolution in that way. Just as biological evolution has really no end, then human creativity and human cultural evolution needn't have one either. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Any questions from the audience? I have a question, and when you say that artists could focus on adaptive solution, in what sense do you mean adaptive? Because like biologists, when they speak of adaptive, it means like reproducing faster, more, and so on. What should be and that in some sense is the goal of genetic evolution, to just replicate itself.
Right.
What would be the goal towards which artists seek adaptation?
Well, a couple of things. So I think that the goal of human cultural evolution may not be exactly the same as sort of selfish gene view of biological evolution. And if you think of people as able to control the process of creation, and I was listening to Monteverdi the other day. This music's 400 years old, and yet still, it's not original by today's standard, but it touches something that is very valuable. It increases the quality of life in a very basic way. And so if that becomes more of the criterion, what am I as an individual consumer of culture going to get out of the experience of being with this culturally produced artifact, then I think it's a different kind of game. Even though there are analogies to be made with biological evolution, it's not necessarily this hyper-competitive dynamic, but there's a sense of which, just like you have these wonderfully rich ecosystems evolving through these particular mechanisms, that's sort of the alternative endgame I have. What do I spend my time doing? Look at great art, listen to great music, things that really are not just new for their own sake, but really really matter a lot to the human condition. And obviously, it's very hard to do that. If we could all do that, you know, we would all be great artists. But I think it's that sense of a shift in priorities, which, as you know, agents having some free will, we're in more of a position to act on than sort of brute force biological forces. I don't know if that's...
Yeah.
Okay.
Because like the quote from Martindale that you put up was just about getting people's attention.
Right.
That is, of course, could be a goal, and
Right.
it probably is a goal from some people in the celebrity world.
Sure, and so it's a question like, what is the time scale that you know, there's one thing to get attention, how long are you able to maintain that
Yes.
attention? And so maybe that's the key aspect.
And but of course, unfortunately, there is also fierce competition among artists because they need money. So if I go to one play, I'm not going to 100 other plays that are going on at the same time,
Right.
in the same town.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do not have the answer to society's problems.
Yeah.
But if you don't entertain the alternative, then it's hard to imagine doing anything about it. So one reason I like talking about this stuff is that it's very new. It's stuff that I haven't thought all the way through. But it seems to me like there's some interesting stuff there. And so, yeah, where it goes is an open question. But yeah, it's more of what can we do with, what does this perspective give you in terms of understanding the larger dynamic? Whether or not you can actually do anything about it later on. So that's a separate question.
Yeah, but in the understanding always brings more possibilities to
I hope
be
so.
active. Yes.
Yeah.
There was a question here?
There's also the unfortunate fact that art right now is a part of the consumer economy, and what that means is that organizations will assume what the consumer wants, which is novelty, then they will
Right.
give it to them, and then through overexposure, people kind of get used to the idea that they probably want novelty. And so I think this is a really pressing issue, this
Yeah.
whole drive of novelty for novelty's sake, and I would be very happy if you could manage to come up with some kind of...
I would be too.
Well, on this hopeful note, I think we have to close because most of you have class somewhere else. And thank you again.
Thank you.